I think Patrick is working to set that up. So is it all ready, Patrick?
Yes, we are officially recording.
There you go.
Thank you for that. Hello, everybody. My name is London, and I'll be going over a couple of notes on how the discussion will work today. First, we will have some commemorative comments from Rabbi Mark Perman, and then Dr. Stone will present. Then we will invite questions from the audience, including some of our Lead 401 students, which includes me, who will ask. And then we ask you to introduce yourselves by name and organization before speaking, and keep in mind the true civility principles when doing so, which are on the screen. And following up, I want to introduce Rabbi Mark Perman. Rabbi Mark Perman is rabbi and cantor of Be'er Chaim congregation in Cumberland. Oh, I'm sorry, would you like to?
Be'er Chaim.
Okay, Be'er Chaim.
Well of life, Be'er Chaim, that's good, you got it.
Perfect, or congregation in Cumberland. During these past 4 years, he has led an interfaith Passover Seders at different churches and helped to reinstate an interfaith Thanksgiving service, which brings people from different faiths together for a service held at different houses of worship each year. He is also part of a refugee resettlement group, which has been organized across denominational lines here in our community and has cooperated with community partners to help combat the opioid heroin epidemic in our area. At FSU, he has been featured on an Interfaith Roundtable TV program and was featured just last spring with others during a leadership residency discussion on interfaith leadership. We will now welcome him to say a few words of commemoration about the Holocaust.
So am I looking straight ahead? Because I don't know where oh, is that me? There I am, okay. Well, the genocide that destroyed so many lives during the years between 1939 and 1945 will never be forgotten. Although it is up to us and future generations to keep those memories alive. That's why we say the phrase, never again. And one of the foundations of the beginning of the state of Israel was this notion of never again, because now we have our own state, in part came out of the ravages of the Holocaust. And thank God we have that state, which we wish we had had during the time of the genocide. But of course, we didn't have the state at that particular time. Sadly, all we have to do is look around the globe today to see that genocide and the mass murder of civilians is not a thing of the past. Unfortunately, the lessons of the past have not been applied today. Man's inhumanity to man continues, and the same hateful impulses that brought about the Holocaust still plays out in places like Syria, in Yemen, parts of Africa, and against minority Muslim groups in places like China. North Korea is said to have concentration camps as well. So we have to be grateful to writers and scholars like Judy Stone, who are willing to reflect back to their youth and to the incredible experiences of their parents and their grandparents. She has painstakingly made an effort and succeeded in having created a historical record of what her family went through during those terrible years of the Second World War, 1939, 1945 being the worst period of time for the Jews and for many, many others. Let's not forget, it's not only the Jews who suffered, 6 million, plenty other groups, gypsies, homosexuals, communists, the enemies of the Reich, all kinds of things. Her writings speak truth to those Holocaust deniers. We have a number of them who deny that the Holocaust ever happened, or they're haters who even today insist that it was grossly exaggerated, right? It's all propaganda from the Jewish people. That's what they say. So let's all pray that the rallying cry of never again will not only ring true for all time when it comes to the Jewish people, but for all humanity and for all time. So I'll just sing something briefly. It's called Eli Eli, and it's poetry that was written by Hannah Senesh, who was a martyr of our people. She parachuted into occupied France. She was an amazing person. Unfortunately, she was caught, captured, and shot. But she wrote these words, and it was applied to this music. Oh Lord, my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, sure.
Rabbi Mike Perman. We definitely appreciate you saying those couple of words, and I'll now hand the mic over to Jamie to introduce Dr. Stone formally.
I would just like to say thank you to Rabbi Perman for that. That was beautiful. And I get the honor of today of introducing our speaker, Dr. Judy Stone. So Dr. Judy Stone is the daughter of Hungarian Holocaust survivors, a physician specializing in infectious diseases, and an author. She is a Forbes Pharma and Healthcare contributor, a former columnist for Scientific American, and the author of a nationally recognized textbook, Conducting Clinical Research, A Practical Guide. Dr. Stone's clinical practice and writings have been shaped by growing up as a child of survivors. Dr. Stone came to Cumberland in 1983, wanting to practice in an underserved area. She had a solo infectious disease practice until 1983, and since then has practiced part-time in Pennsylvania. Her latest book is Resilience, One Family's Story of Hope and Triumph Over Evil, a study in human contrast, kindness and callousness, tolerance and hatred, humanity and cruelty. She will share what she has learned through extensive research and her family's story of survival. So without further ado.
Well, thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? There you go. Thank you for the introduction and for the kind invitation. And I enjoyed working with you all this spring. I'm having some trouble with the slides.
I'm not hearing you that well, Judy.
Okay, I will try. There we go. So as Jamie
That's
said,
better.
As Jamie said, I'm the daughter of Holocaust survivors, Hungarian survivors, and too many people don't even know what the Holocaust was, which is why I wrote the book. It was also a promise to my mother and uncle, and my family wanted me to share their stories and not let their lives and lessons be forgotten. They left their mark, trying to leave the world a more just, kinder place, and their memories are indeed a blessing, as we say in Judaism. So this is my mother, who very much shaped me, and my daughter. This is my mother's 94th birthday, and it was when she was dying that she said, you know, start taking notes and tell this story. Take out your computer because I know you won't remember things. This is my uncle, who was Alex, or Shani, who was the family historian and kept many of the records that were the basis for this book. And my Aunt Kitty, who is an inspiration. She's 95 now, and yet she is an avid educator, Holocaust educator in Iowa. I began seriously writing this book, Resilience, in 2016 because of the divisiveness that I saw worsening in our country at that time in the lead up to the election and since then. And as I researched and I spoke more with my Aunt Kitty, I saw more parallels between the 1930s in Germany and now. So I want to give you just a brief overview, very, very brief. In the 1930s, the mood in Germany was grim because of their defeat in World War I, and economic pressures worsened because of their need to pay reparations to the rest of Europe for what they'd done in World War I. These conditions provided the chance for Adolf Hitler and his party, or the Nazi Party, to rise into power. A lot of people don't know that, that Hitler was elected with 37% of the vote. And at that time, the German parliament gave Hitler almost unlimited power. They suspended civil liberties and constitutional liberties in February of 1933. And this is paralleled now with Hungary Actually, Hungary's parliament just suspended powers and gave all the power and basically a dictatorship to Viktor Orban to rule the country in perpetuity. In March of 1933, Hitler established the Dachau concentration camp, initially for political prisoners. That's where my father and uncle were later incarcerated. In 1938, 32 countries got together under what's called the Evian Conference to recognize the growing German Jewish refugee problem and acknowledge that there was a problem, but they didn't offer to extend any quotas or help to the Jewish people. Then Kristallnacht came, which is the Night of Broken Glass in November, which was carefully orchestrated, and Jewish synagogues and businesses were looted and trashed, and 30,000 German Jewish men were arrested just for being Jewish, and they were sent to concentration camps and forced into ghettos. So let me switch now to my family's story briefly. My father grew up in Debrecen, which was the major city in the eastern part of Hungary. It was quite cosmopolitan. It had about 100,000 people, electricity, transportation, theater, universities, quite sophisticated city for that time. In contrast, my mother grew up 15 kilometers away in this village called Sárand, where there was no running water. There were dirt roads. Even when I went there in 1978, there were still dirt roads with animals running freely in the streets. And it was a rural, agricultural, pretty impoverished town with not much in the way of schooling and nothing in the way of culture beyond that. So the city mouse and the country mouse met when my mother went to apprentice herself. And
Sorry. Let me just say, I can hear your paper rustling a lot. No, that's okay. Just so you know and you're aware of it. So
okay, well, I will
let me take you back.
Okay.
And I'll let go of the controls because I know we're sharing a screen. So if you see the battle over the slides going, that's what's going on. We're learning.
Okay, that's fine. So there were, my mother came from a family with 8 children. There's not time to focus on all of them, so I'm mostly going to tell you about the girls in the family, as is appropriate. So this was my grandmother, Anna. She was known for being very strict and demanding and a not very affectionate mother. Here she is with Clara, who was my favorite aunt, the baby Henduka, and Kitty when she was 7. And my grandmother was very partial, and she towards her daughters. She didn't like Kitty. She thought she was ugly, so she didn't take Kitty with her on vacations or to family get-togethers. So they went to the family went to a wedding of another cousin, and many of them who attended the wedding became sick, and my grandmother and the baby died of typhoid fever, and Clara and my mother became very ill with that. Kitty was not ill because she was left at home. But so Anna and the baby, this all affected them in 1932. So there were 2 deaths, 2 other hospitalizations, and it pretty much bankrupted my grandfather and his family at that time. My mother was 12 years older than Kitty and essentially ended up raising her for the rest of their childhood. In this picture, you see my grandfather more, my mother and father when they were dating in 1936, and Kitty when she's about 10 or 11. But things were very, very hard after those deaths in 1932. This is my mother again, Clara. The 4th sister we'll talk about, Betty, who looks a little more exotic. She was known as the Tsigány or Gypsy, and for her more exotic looks, and was also called Queen Elizabeth, both as a play on her name and because she was somewhat haughty. And this cousin was the closest cousin to my mother and her sisters, and she and her parents and her children were all killed in Auschwitz. So it was a major, major loss for the family. In the lead up to the war, there were what were called Nuremberg laws. And in these, some of the laws were that there were restrictions on who could be a civil servant. and who could be educated and go into different professions. So here's Alex when he was younger, and he wanted to go to math school, but he wasn't at the university. He wasn't allowed to study math there because he was Jewish, and only 6%, matching their proportion in the population, could study. Miri, his friend here, was literally thrown out of the university there and thrown down the stairs. And this is Miri's sister, who later helped save my mother in the camps and married her brother. Okay, what did we do here? I don't know how to get out of that. Can you go back to the full screen?
I think that it's very sensitive, so I think that's what's going on. I'm also going to take this opportunity to lock the meeting. So let me just do that, take a pause here, if I can do that, just so that we don't have distraction of people trying to come into the meeting late.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, see, I don't know. You just have to watch. I think it's kind of clicking out, so we just have to keep the mouse down here, I think, on the lower left.
Yeah, that's what I was doing.
I don't know why it's doing that. So I'm going to mute myself. So.
Okay. And now you're gone. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I lost the screen. Okay. So this is my grandfather Moore, and he was a decorated officer in World War I. And as such, he thought that he would be protected as things got tighter in the 1930s, 1940. But however, that wasn't true. He lost his liquor license and experienced a great economic squeeze on his business, which was a general store and a tavern. And this Aryanization of businesses is what it was called, was where Jews had to give up control of their businesses and turn it over to Gentiles. Okay, I'm going to let you drive, Alicia. I'm just going to tell you when I want the next slide.
Yeah, I think that might work better. I think for whatever reason, it's kind of glitchy going back and forth with control. Yeah. So let me make sure that I have the right control. And sorry, everybody. This is part of what we're learning, how to do better. So. All right, so you might have to adjust, withdraw the permission. So let me try that. That should work. And let me just share our screen. We're trying different things different ways. Our earlier host had the PowerPoint, and I have it this time, but it's all good because I think we just need to catch you up, though. Is it here?
Okay, there we are, yes. So thank you. This is what the family looked like just before the war in the late 1930s and 1940. So on the upper left, you see Kitty, who's now grown into a lovely young woman of 18. Clara, with her smoky dark eyes, looking exotic. Queen Elizabeth, and my mother and father when they were engaged. In the lower picture is my father with his mother, Alex, and his older brother Zennern before they went off to war. Next picture, please. The Nazis invaded Hungary on March 19th, 1944. They really didn't need very many people to help them do that because the Hungarians were more than happy to assist them. The Hungarians were cruel, were anti-Semitic, and really very complicit in rounding up the Jews. They had their own cruel branch of the Nazis, as it were, called the Arrow Cross. Next, please. When the Nazis came in, the Jews had to wear the yellow star. And at first, the Jews were allowed out of their houses for short times during the day. Later, they were totally confined on house arrest. But Kitty was at home with her father, and a neighbor friend decided to take her out for a little bit and cheer her up. Just as we're on quarantine, it was far worse for them. So when they went out, her lapel fell over, hiding hiding her Jewish star, and she was arrested and taken to a jail in the nearby village 6 kilometers away. Next, please. She later went back in the 1980s, and she found Zsófi néni, who was the housekeeper for their family, who would walk the 6 miles and bribe someone to get her out of jail and back to her father's home. Next, please. I want to focus more on some of the good people who helped save them during the war. I don't think we hear enough about not only righteous Gentiles, but Jews as well. And there are lessons for our time now that I think are quite relevant. Tote Bözsi was my grandfather's best friend. He was a widower who lived across the dirt lane from my grandfather and Kitty. And when the Germans invaded Hungary, soldiers came and wanted to rape Kitty. For several weeks after that, every night she sneaked across the lane and took her blanket and pillow and went to sleep in hiding under Tote Bözsi's bed on the dirt floor, surrounded by his chickens that were running loose in his little one-room shack. Tote Bözsi risked his life every night until they were deported, protecting Kitty. Later, he said he couldn't die until his best friend Mork and Kitty came back from the war because he wanted to see them again. Unfortunately, he didn't survive that long and he died without them, but he did ask to be buried with Kitty's blanket as a remembrance, and in fact, they did do that. Next, please. Clara was a teacher who would climb over the fence to when Kotti and my grandfather were on house arrest. And Clara brought my grandfather and Kitty news and food. And as importantly, he brought them news of the outside world and just demonstrated to them that somebody cared about them and they weren't forgotten and that people still appreciated all that they had done for the community. He committed suicide when they were deported. And Kitty to this day wonders why. Was he threatened for having been friends with Jews, or did somebody report him, or what happened? But he committed suicide. Next, please. My father and his brothers worked initially building roads and railways, and then they were sent to the Eastern Front to clear minefields. Some of you have probably heard about the Apopo hero rats in Angola and other places in Africa. Those rats are being used to be sent out in minefields to sniff out where the landmines are so they can be cleared and prevent people from being injured. Well, they didn't have that in the Eastern Front. The Jews were regarded as no better than rats, and they were sent out in front of the Hungarian and German soldiers and to find where the landmines were. And in fact, one uncle, one of my mother's twin brothers, was blown up by such an occasion. Next, please. Jews everywhere were forced into crowded ghettos where many died from disease. My mother had her first child, my brother, was born in the Debrecen ghetto. Next, please. Many other places, rather than forcing Jews into these old crowded parts of town, they took Jews directly and made a ghetto at the open air brickyards, because that was more convenient to shipping the Jews to the death camps. In Debrecen, my mother was in a crowded, very crowded part of town where multiple families shared an apartment, and that's where my brother was born. But then she was moved to this open air brickyard. There they were. It was cold and it was rainy, just as it has been here in Cumberland lately. And my 2-week-old brother died of exposure and pneumonia in that brickyard. One of the things that I found quite striking is that later on, my mother could appreciate that having her baby die actually saved her life. And she recognized that she would have been immediately killed had she arrived in Auschwitz either pregnant or with a newborn baby. So her finding that much meaning in this horrible event was really quite remarkable to me. Next, please. When you arrived at Auschwitz, there was chaos. You see German soldiers here in their spiffy uniforms, the Jews in the striped uniforms, prisoners who had been in the camps for a while, and there's really chaos and crowding. When you arrived at Auschwitz, you were separated into various categories. Next, please. First, the men were taken from the women. And here you can see women waiting with their children and looking very fearfully as to what's going to happen to them. This procedure was called selection. Next, please. Selection determined who shall live. In this case, my aunts Betty, Kitty, and my mother Maggie. Next, please. And who shall die. And here it was my grandmother Ella and her son Zennern. Ella was 54, so she was considered over the hill and expendable. My uncle had meningitis when he was a child, and he was left mentally disabled. And so he was not considered fit for work. And so he was immediately gassed when he arrived. My grandfather on the right was 65, younger than I am now. And yet he was considered too old to be worth saving his life, and he was sent to be gassed. The bottom picture is not an immediate family, but the boy on the right in the picture is my cousin Andy, who was 15 at the time. And I add his picture because their story was very different. He was the sole survivor in his branch of the family. His mother and the other siblings were killed at Auschwitz, and his father was murdered in front of him. After he was liberated, Andy went to Palestine and fought for the War of Liberation for Israel and served in the Palmach. There, he was one of 3 survivors in his unit. And yet what's remarkable to me, I didn't know this until my daughter was a teenager. I never knew his story. But what was remarkable was, despite all these horrors and traumas that he lived through, he was one of the kindest, nicest, and most generous people, and I think sanest people in our family. But despite this different course. Next, please. So these 2 aunts and my mother survived Auschwitz in different ways. And Clara survived as well, but she wasn't in Auschwitz. She had escaped a death march from Budapest to Austria, and she was hidden. That was no picnic either. She had her own traumas, including having been raped by the guard who saved her life. So here are the 3 sisters who were in Auschwitz. My Aunt Betty was arrested on March 19th, when the Germans invaded Hungary. She was arrested as a political prisoner, and she was assigned to work in a part of Auschwitz called Canada, which was a horrific part where the prisoners had to go through the clothes of prisoners who had been gassed and murdered and take out valuables, food and any jewelry and any valuable belongings as they sorted these clothes. It was a pretty gruesome part of the camp to work at. And as I researched this book and listened to her stories at the Spielberg Foundation tapes and read more about the war, I realized that experience in Canada was probably part of why she, when I knew her, as an adult, and when I was growing up, knew her as a very cold, almost callous kind of person, and very different in personality than the other sisters, though all were scarred in different ways. Kitty in the middle arrived next in Auschwitz in June of 1944. So she was with her father until they were, from being in the ghetto through walking to the next ghetto in Oradea, Romania, and then on the cattle cars to Auschwitz, and they were together until they were separated at selection. And she did not know what happened to her father really until after the war. She could not believe that, despite rumors, she could not believe that he had been murdered. My mother arrived on July 1st, and one of the things that was surprising here is that although the women, except those working in Canada, the other women had their heads shorn and were given, these rags to wear. But women sometimes recognized each other. And so when my mother arrived, somebody told Kati that, hey, your sister's here. And although they were not allowed to move from one barracks to another, Kati decided she had to go see her sister. This was illegal. She risked death by doing so. But she sneaked into my mother's bunkhouse or barracks, and that's when she learned that my mother had lost her baby and was emotionally and physically a wreck at that point. She decided that she had to stay with my mother, and although she initially returned to her own barracks and tried to beg her friend Itza, who was also from Sharon, to come with her and change barracks, Itza said no, that God had wanted her to be in that barracks, and she was going to stay there. But Kati left anyway, feeling that her primary responsibility was to her sister, who had helped raise her, and that she in turn would now take care of her. So Kitty was able to slip into change barracks because so many women were dying that the Nazis couldn't keep track of them. The women didn't have names there, they only had numbers. And as I say, it was chaos, and they simply could not keep track of them. All they did was they lined the women up several times a day. They had roll call, or appel it was called, and the women had to line up in rows of 5 for hours sometimes, and they only looked at the number of bodies that were there. And if it matched what they expected, then the women could go again for a while. So when Kitty went back a few days later to check on her friend Itza, and she found that all the women in that barracks had vanished overnight. 1,000 women had gone up in smoke with no trace. And Kitty felt horrible that she had left her friend, and felt burdened by this forever. Next, please. So while my family was very lucky, I would say, in that we had a number of survivors, and I really didn't appreciate until 2008, after my mother died, how lucky we were and how unusual it was for Hungarian Jews to survive the Holocaust. Basically, about 10% did. And yet here I had my mother and her siblings, except for the one brother. And yet, as I did more research, I learned that at least 80 other family members were murdered at Auschwitz. Next, please. After 9 weeks together in Auschwitz, there was another selection, and Kitty was sent to the Allendorf munitions plant. She went back there in the 1980s, and you can see still that the trees were planted on tops of the building to camouflage the munitions plant from the Allied bombing. At that selection, my mother was thrown back because a guard noticed that she had milk leaking from her breast, and so rejected her from the selection, and everybody assumed that my mother had been killed at that time. Next, please. Kitty did pretty well at Allendorf. The women were fed better and had somewhat better conditions because of the toxic chemicals that they worked with. And so in fact, at that particular camp, almost all of the women survived. One of the things that happened, I guess it's close to 2 years ago, while I was gathering records, I asked the Holocaust Museum in DC, and I'd asked the International Tracing Service at Bad Arolsen for records, and I hadn't gotten very much. And in particular, I wanted to know when my grandfather died. And the reason for that is because in Jewish tradition, you remember you have as a memorial when somebody died, and that's called yahrzeit, the anniversary of their death. And you say special prayers for them and have remembrances. I know in my husband's family, they observe the birthday of their ancestors. So it's a different culture. And it always bothered me that I didn't know when my grandfather died. I did know, as I mentioned, that they were together. He was together with Kitty. And I did get these records from the Holocaust Museum. And this is a Häftling card, or prisoner card. The Germans were meticulous in keeping track of notes about their prisoners. And this is like a hospital admissions intake form. It has the person's name and date of birth and their parents and their next of kin and all of that sort of thing that you might expect. But here I noticed, and I didn't see it the first time I looked at it, there is this line where the white arrow is that says the date she arrived at Auschwitz as June 28th, 1944. And that told me that that was when my grandfather was killed. And that was like a sucker punch seeing this card. Next, please. My mother, in fact, obviously wasn't killed at Auschwitz, or I wouldn't be here talking to you. But at that separation, somehow they decided not to kill her. And she was sent, a few weeks later, she was sent to a different work factory. She was sent to Berlin to an airplane factory. This was no picnic either. She was working on an assembly line at a very rapid pace, and it was tough. One of the rare kind things that happened there is that her foreman learned that she could sew. And so he let her sit down for a little bit instead of standing on line all day on the assembly line and then standing in roll call for hours. He actually let her sit down a little bit to sew gloves for his son, who was on the Eastern Front. And in addition to letting her sit, he gave her a few apples, which she was able to share with her, the other prisoners. Next, please. When the Nazis knew that they were losing, they herded all the Jews on a more than 100-mile march called the Death March. They didn't really care where they were going for the most part. They just wanted to walk them until they dropped dead so that the Allies couldn't find that the camps and that the Germans had killed them there. My Aunt Betty started in the middle of winter, and she, again, had a worse time than my mother or the other relatives with this. She was so ill at one point. If you fell back on these marches, then you were shot and killed. Women, again, in these, just like in the camps in roll call, they remained in rows of 5 when they were being marched. And one of the things that helped Betty survive, as well as my aunt, as well as my mother, is that younger, stronger women took the outside of these rows so that they would hide the weaker ones from the guards. And that happened with both Betty and my mother and helped them survive their respective death marches. My mother walked 150 miles over 17 days with no food from Berlin to the North Sea, where she was liberated. And then she somehow managed to walk back to Berlin and then find various trains, wagons, whatever, to find her way back to Hungary. Next, please. The brothers were, as I said, on the Eastern Front, and then my father and brother were in Dachau, which was one of the more notorious concentration camps. And I'm not going to go into all the details of what happened to them there. It's a miracle. They were together throughout the war and throughout most of their lives. Alex and my father were together, except for 6 weeks at the end of the war when my father had typhus and was separated. Next, please. People ask me, how did family find each other after they were liberated? And there were several ways. In this case, there were newsletters, as you see on the left, and that literally translates to news of those who were dragged away. From where, how many of them and when did that happen is what the next line says. So there were news on the radio sometimes and lists in the newspapers and then these special newsletters. Kitty was liberated by American Air Force men when at the end of the war, the commandant of Allendorf, he had been ordered to send the women to Buchenwald to be exterminated there, to be gassed there, but he didn't do that. He let the women go, in part to save himself, presumably, and in part because several of the women, including my Aunt Kitty, say that he had moments of kindness and wasn't that bad a guy, which is a somewhat interesting description. So he released them into the countryside and they were found by American Air Force men. And because it wasn't safe for them to live in the German villages, they took them back to the Air Force Base. And this is Fritzlar Air Force Base, which the Americans had appropriated. And they had the women work there as maids or waitresses. Next, please. The two sisters that you saw in the first picture with Alex at the university were with Kitty at this Air Force base. They heard Alex's name on the radio and were able to get in touch with him at the DP camp, or displaced persons camp, where he was recuperating from being in Dachau. And he joined them at Fritzlar in Zennern, Germany. And Betty found her way there too. Again, similarly, word of mouth, we found your relative. Everybody assumed that my mother was dead. My father, the picture on the left shows my parents when they were dating. My father went back to first Budapest and then Debrecen, not looking for his wife because he assumed she had died, but looking for his uncle who's in the picture on the right here. And I bring up Uncle Jacob's story because, again, it's a different vignette than the others and that you probably have heard. Jacob, or Jakusz, had raised my father because his own father had died when he was young. And Jacob's wife and sister and daughter, the child in that picture, were all American citizens at that time. He was Hungarian, but the women were all American citizens. And yet they were in Strashof concentration camp. That being American didn't protect them from being rounded up and put in a concentration camp. The child, Mari, was separated from her parents for 9 years after liberation because of faulty papers and because her mother hadn't lied when she went for a visa. Another longer story than we have here, but I bring this up because, again, ICE has been, last fall, and I haven't kept up with it, but certainly last fall, ICE tried to deport a US citizen, Francisco Galicia, to Mexico, even though he was a US citizen. So anybody who says, oh, well, you're fine if you have your papers, not everybody has them on them, and not everybody believes the papers, even when they're presented. So that's what happened to that branch of the family. So Mari grew up without her parents. Next, please. While my father was in Budapest, he learned that my mother was alive. Sorry, I went too fast. He learned that my mother was alive. This was late 1945. He found her in Zennern. They moved back to Debrecen and tried to reestablish their lives there. They had a business making orthopedic appliances and braces. Somebody else, one of their competitors, had taken over their store and their apartment, and they could not get anything back and reestablish themselves. So after 6 months of trying, they decided the hell with it, and they went and joined the rest of the family in Zennern at Germany at the Air Force Base. So then they started coming to America. Now, Kitty, as I say, she was 20 when she was liberated. And then she met this Air Force American bomber pilot at the Air Force Base there at Zennern, at Fritzlar. And she did not want to stay in Hungary. Nobody wanted to go back to Hungary. Nobody wanted to stay in Germany. He was young, he was handsome, and she knew that marrying an American was a way to get out of Europe. So I believe she was in love at the time. You know, she was young, she was infatuated, and she came to America. Now, after they weren't married when she got here. And in fact, the US tried to keep them from getting married because she was Jewish. But eventually she came here, and as they were getting married, he said, oh, by the way, you can't tell anybody that you're Jewish. I don't want anybody in Iowa to know that about your past or that you were in the war or anything that happened to you. So here she is, not speaking much of any English, few words, not having any money, and finds herself alone on a farm in Iowa. Tough way to start a life here in America. Soon she had 3 children, 600 chickens, and a tough life there. Eventually she divorced. Next, please. But she did not tell anybody that she was Jewish. She did not come out until 2008, which was astonishing to me. And her children were raised as Lutheran. We had interesting family get-togethers, hiding each of us what our religion was. Betty had been, the picture actually on the cover of my book is of Betty's first wedding. Betty also, her husband from her first marriage was shot and killed on the Eastern Front. Somebody wanted his overcoat, so murdered him for it. Betty met an American Air Force captain and married him, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Texas and then Denver. And her children were all raised Catholic. Next, please. The siblings continued to scatter. This is my parents, my mother looking down at my brother, her second baby, in the carriage, and Clara and her husband as they're leaving Hamburg, Germany. Next, please. The best thing that Kitty's husband did for her and the family was that he sponsored Clara and her husband to come to the U.S. Now, again, one of the things that people don't know about immigration is that you had to have a sponsor. You still have to have a sponsor. You can't just decide that you're going to come to the U.S. Because even then they didn't want anybody to be a financial burden. So Pete and Kitty said they would provide support for her sister in exchange for them coming to Iowa. Now this worked pretty well, except that as you remember, Pete didn't want anybody to know that Kitty was Jewish, and Clara's husband's name was Goldstein. So that didn't work out very well, as you can imagine. So Clara and her husband moved to Detroit and settled there and with other friends of theirs, and he did auto work there. Next, please. This is the twin brother who was not murdered on the Eastern Front, and I just mention him because he had tuberculosis. So there are lots of questions about why he didn't come to the US, but the major one, despite the question of sponsorship and who agreed or who didn't agree, was that he had tuberculosis, and people with infectious diseases or history of infectious diseases like that weren't allowed to come to this country. So he moved to Israel. Next, please. This was my parents' cruise ship, very classy trooper, Marine Jumper, it was called, and very crowded. And my parents came, they were initially sponsored by an uncle in Little Falls, New York. And when they arrived there, the family sponsoring them, the children had measles. So the quarantine officer wouldn't let my parents stay there. And they had to move to be with another aunt in New York City. The only English that my mother knew at that time really was goddamn dippies, displaced people, which is what the American soldiers called the Jewish refugees. Goddamn dippies. Next, please. My parents then, after living in New York, they moved to Washington, where my father again resumed his business as an orthotist, and I was born there. And they moved to Denver, and this photo was in the Denver Post about the Nazi refugees setting up a new life in Denver. And my father died when I was 12, just when things were comfortable for them for the first time in their lives. Next, please. Alex, who you saw in the first slide, Alex waited until everyone else, my father's brother, till everyone else was safely out. And I use him to illustrate the value of immigrants. You remember he wasn't allowed to go to school to study mathematics because he was Jewish. He became a lawyer but couldn't practice law for the same reason. After liberation, he became a watch repairman in Germany. And then when he wasn't working on the black market, as most people did to support themselves, then when he came to the US, he worked as an orthotist with my father. And then late in the 1950s, he was finally able to study mathematics. He got his degree in mathematics, then became a computer scientist and moved on to retire from the Jet Propulsion Lab and space program as a senior scientist in the space program, and was well enough regarded that the LA Times had a story about his retirement. Next, please. I met this woman, Betty, another Betty, or Bözsi Losonczi, when I went to Hungary with my mother in 1978, when we discovered that she had a nephew who was alive, who no one had known about his existence until 1977, which again is a whole other story for another day. But I didn't know anything about Betty because my mother still was not talking to me about her experiences in Hungary or during the Holocaust, hardly at all, until late in her life. So all I knew is that my mother wanted to see her old friend Betty more than anything. And I went knocking on doors around Debrecen. Betty had been one of 12 siblings, and so I figured somebody was likely to know this large family. And sure enough, I found her, and their expression of joy when they were reunited was just incredible. But I wish I'd known why Betty was so important to her. I didn't know that until a few years ago, when I learned that Betty, as a young woman, had gone to my mother's village to offer her own birth certificate and identification card to Kitty, who she's with in this picture, because Kitty was blonde-haired and blue-eyed and could have passed as Gentile. The pictures that we have, many of these pictures that we have that are saved, were hidden under the thatched roof of Betty's house by her father, her and her father. Later, she and her father brought my mother food when she was starving in the ghetto. And after the war, they immediately took Clara in when she found her way home and needed to be nursed back to health. So I didn't know these stories in 1978. I thought Betty was just another frumpy, matronly old lady. And what I learned is how much I misjudged her. And again, as they say, not all heroes wear capes. Next, please. This is my family, minus my father, in 1984 here in Cumberland at my wedding. And all of their sterling white hair. And from left to right, Betty and her husband, Jack, Kitty, my uncle Alex, my mother, Clara and her husband, and Miklos and his wife, Ella, who was one of those sisters in that first picture. Next, please. So I mentioned in 1938 that the Evian Conference refused to accept Jews. I need to share some of the parallels with you that Kitty has told me about the 1930s and current events, particularly because of what happened last fall in Syria. And again, I know some of you won't see things the way I do, but it's pertinent for you to know this. So as we said, in 1938, the Evian Conference refused to accept Jews. The SS St. Louis, you might have read about, was a refugee ship that was denied entry to Cuba and the US and Canada in 1939 and was forced to return to Europe, where many of those passengers were put in concentration camps and killed. Next, please. Do you see parallels with what's been happening here and refugees? Next, please. There are many other parallels which we won't get into now due to time constraints. Kitty, as I mentioned, Kitty reinvented herself and in 2008 began teaching students about the Holocaust. And some of her lessons are that you need to stop the othering and divisiveness. She feels strongly, she emphasizes that we all have the same wants and needs, and no matter what our color is or what our ethnicity or where we came from. Kindness is an act of bravery in its own and is its own form of resistance. And that was true in the camp. You know, any of those little acts, little quote unquote acts of kindness were by changing places with somebody, by helping support somebody in the roll call lines so that they didn't collapse, by sharing food with somebody or sharing your rags with them. Any of those small acts were forms of resistance, and these acts of kindness were grounds for having somebody murder you, having the guards murder you, because they were all forbidden acts. So she tells the kids that when they see somebody being bullied or feeling isolated because they're different, they should smile or make eye contact or walk with somebody and keep them company. She encourages them not to be a bystander and to protect anybody who's being bullied, and to be a witness. And again, to read news from a variety of sources and stay informed, and to vote and work to make positive change. Next, please. Again, I hope, it makes me sad that so many people don't know anything about the Holocaust. And if we don't learn about these events, then we will repeat them. Next, please. The 1930s, Jews, Romas, and Blacks were deprived of citizenship. Racism was used against Jews and non-Aryans to rise to power. And Hitler literally said, "Make Germany great again." Next, please. Some of the news headlines I don't want us continuing to see here are when being Jewish means being afraid, Tamir Rice shooting, other shootings of young Black men, getting killed by police is a leading cause of death for young Black men. Americans fear Muslim terrorists more than white supremacists, even though almost all of the mass killings in the US have been from white supremacists. Next, please. Here's Kitty speaking. Last year, I found this on the internet. She was talking at the public library there, and I contacted the library and said, how many people were there? What was going on? They said, oh, there were a little over 400 people. She's a prominent speaker in Omaha. I would say she lives for this, literally. This keeps her going. And it's very hard for her now being self-isolated at home because she's at very high risk for dying from COVID. And so she's not been able to do any of her teaching this spring that she normally would be doing for Holocaust anniversaries. Next, please. So one of my favorite pictures, again, the point being that all of these relatives and many, those of other people, most people who came to this country, raised good kids. They were loving people, they contributed to society, they worked hard, and they instilled important values in their kids. And in fact, in our family, many of my generations, many of the children, my cousins, went into helping professions in some way. Next, please. Kindness was critical to survival and deciding who shall live and who shall die. As I mentioned, some of the righteous people included Tote Bocce, who hid Kitty under his bed, excuse me, Betty, who offered her ID to Kitty, the teacher who climbed over the fence to bring them food and keep them company and show them he cared. These two sisters who became, the one on the left became Miklós's wife, and any number of other people that are listed there who did good things to help save my family and other Jews as well. Next, please. And I wanted to mention that kindness is going to be critical to us now with COVID as well. So just as the teacher brought my family groceries and news, it's important, and we're seeing young people in particular delivering groceries and bringing news, excuse me, delivering groceries to people who are shut in and for whom it's not safe to go grocery shopping. There were women who helped Maggie in the camps, and there are other COVID patients caring for patients, particularly in Israel. They have patients with COVID caring for other patients and comforting them as they're dying. Here, I don't know why we have not allowed that. It would be a very helpful way emotionally and psychologically for people to have that support. And I'm surprised that we're so far behind the curve in that. When my mother's baby died, she gave the baby's diapers and other items to another woman who needed them for her own child. So now we have people making and donating masks, and skiers donating goggles for doctors and other PPE. Women in the kitchen and the camps shared peelings that they would steal from and share them with their bunkmates. It wasn't all. I'm sure there were people who didn't help each other, but many of the women did help and share their food and clothing. And now we have restaurants feeding workers and feeding people, just as here in Cumberland this weekend, the Islamic Society had a food drive that they provided for people in the community who were hungry. And Lisa Wolford and Alan McDaniel and their team go around collecting food for people in need here. There was a mutual aid network in the camps. And again, that's something that's going to be critical here. And we're seeing it with people offering to babysit and provide help for frontline workers. Next, please. So my take-home message to you, besides remembering history and please get out and vote, vote this fall if we have elections again, is to remember to care for each other as these sisters are caring for each other here. Next, please. And be the eye and kind. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yay, thank you so much, Dr. Stone. Thank you. I've heard that story before, but I learned something new each time. And parallels, I think, are incredible. So we're going to open it up to questions. I'm sorry?
And we're very abbreviated here.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of it's the Zoom context. I know it's harder for people to take time online, but we do want to give time for people to ask some questions. We also have some questions that our students prepared, but let me just open it up to see if anyone wants to raise a hand or offer something in chat to start the questions.
Is there a way to see everybody? Because I just see a poster that says kind. Oh, there you go.
Terrific. Nice seeing you again.
Is Albert related to you?
Yeah, that's my dad, Rabbi.
Oh.
So I was going to say, if you're willing and you're able and you want to turn on your video now, it's a nice way to interact that way, even if you're still listening. But does anyone want to start with any questions?
Oh.
Your father does.
Unmute yourself. Here, I'll unmute you. There you go.
Okay, yes, Dr. Stone. I was just wondering how many members of your family actually died there?
Well, as I say, in the broader family, there were over 80. In my immediate family, it was my grandparents and a couple of uncles. So we were extraordinarily lucky, and my brother, if you count his dying in the ghetto.
Thank you so much for doing this presentation, and not only here but around, because people cannot afford to forget about the Holocaust.
I appreciate your saying that, and you know, I'm anxious to teach others and to share this story, even though it's hard to do and stirs up a lot for me. It's important that people know, because there's so many parallels to what's happening now with the divisiveness and the hate mongering that's going on, and you know, prohibiting immigrants from coming to the country, racial divisions, all sorts of things. So it's really frightening parallels.
I agree.
Have you done any research into, you know, how so many people could have turned against the Jews but still have been supportive of Christians and said it's okay to be Christian, it's okay to be Catholic, whatever, considering the history of Christianity, and that, you know, Jesus is Jewish. So if Jesus was brought into that realm, he would have been put into a concentration camp himself. So was there ever any connection or any understanding that anybody had at that time, or were they just totally disconnected from?
Well, you know, I haven't heard that. I mean, there was a lot of the belief about Jews killing Jesus, and that fomenting a lot of the hate too. I don't know what specifically you're referring to. Or Joy,
Well, I mean,
you add anything?
What?
I see Joy there, and so I didn't know if she might add anything.
Oh, go ahead, Joy.
She studies this.
Well, that's if not the major question, surely a major question. And I think there is a very, I mean, there's centuries of anti-Semitism within Christianity, and if you're interested in a book that really talks about that in great detail, you might read the book Constantine's Sword. And so there simply was an overwhelming amount of anti-Semitism. And I think Dr. Stone Judy has talked about this before. The anti-Semitism in Germany was enormous, and it was elsewhere also. I mean, at the Avian conference, the opportunity was given to every other country to take, I mean, Hitler and the Nazis were very clear. Nobody did, nobody. So that's significant. I mean, there's an enormous amount of bias, hatred that is totally unfounded, but exists. And I mean, there's more to say there. I think
It goes back hundreds of years.
It goes back hundreds of years. It goes back to basically Constantine's sword is where it started, when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire. And at that point, Judaism was pilloried. I mean, it everything negative that you could possibly say. So there was pogrom after pogrom, as you well know, throughout the Western world. And I would also say that I do work, and I think Judy, you know, and Rabbi Perman, you know as well. I mean, I go to Auschwitz and virtually every year. This year we won't be going to do healing from war work. One of the things that happened to Germany is that it, and the leader of this work in Poland and in Auschwitz, who is a Jew, basically thinks, and he's not alone, that World War I and World War II are simply one great big war. World War I, the Germans clearly were responsible, but they were, after World War I, made totally responsible, and the reparations and the world came down on them. And if you want to make people really reactive, just blame them completely. And so there were things that that happened to the German people, and the German people obviously are culpable. I mean, they have full responsibility. Thank you. I could go on, but that's enough.
Hey, do we have someone else that wants to ask a question of Dr. Stone about her presentation?
Or anyone else?
We can maybe go to some of our student questions that were prepared before as a way to have a discussion across everyone too.
Sorry, was I on mute? Okay, sorry.
Okay.
I was going to ask a quick question. Just I was on mute by mistake. Sorry. Do you feel like by writing this book, you're keeping a certain memory alive? You're perpetuating their lives to a future generation, so that people, you know, often we watch videos and we see statistics, and you see people in concentration camps, but it's so difficult to comprehend this mass of humanity that's being persecuted. But you have identified specific people with specific stories. Did any of this go to the Spielberg Foundation when they were taking all these stories?
Yes, not all of my relatives spoke to the Spielberg Foundation. That's really when a lot of them started to open up some. None of them talked about it to their children growing up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's only as they got really probably in their 80s that they really started talking about it. I was graduating from college when my mother told me about losing her baby. And then she clammed up again for years. But yes, the other thing that I want to share with this book, a lot of it is to say that these people were not just victims. Okay, they had full lives, rich lives before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. Despite all this horrendous trauma, they were able to recover and go on, recover to various degrees, and each had their own quirks, as you might say, but to go on and have fulfilling lives and raise good kids. And I don't think people hear that. There's too much maligning other people and maligning immigrants, and that's clearly was a major motivation for me in writing this book and in getting out and speaking now, especially the anti-Muslim rhetoric.
I mean, not just immigrants, but asylum seekers, people who legally are trying to get here, who are being persecuted. I mean,
precisely.
Yeah.
And people don't know that. People I talk to who support the Republican Party or the right side, many of them who I talk to have no idea that seeking asylum is legal
Yeah.
and that you have to be physically in the United States to seek asylum.
Mhm.
And so by banning people, keeping them from setting foot in this country, that's killing their chance of seeking asylum. And as I mentioned, I think at the ACC talk or somewhere along the way, and certainly wrote about it in one of my Forbes pieces, when I see the kids, in particular, the kids in cages along the southern border, that reminds me of my mother laying on the floor in Auschwitz with her one piece of bread and bologna a day. You know, it's just a travesty.
Yeah.
And so that's what keeps me fighting against racism and as best as I can in all forms, and xenophobia.
Mhm.
And
No, Jamie, your question might be good at this point, because I know we're going to watch the time. I would say we maybe have 10, maybe 20 minutes tops, because I know we'll start to have people need to go on to the rest of their evening. But this is a good time maybe for that question.
Sure. So mine is, how can sharing and reflecting on past traumas help with traumas today faced by younger generations?
do you have an answer for that too?
No, I do not.
Well, again, I'd be interested in hearing what other people say. I think some of it is simply seeing how other people have handled it. You know, one of the things, I mean, Joy goes back to Auschwitz. My aunt Kitty went back to Germany. They had a reunion for all the prisoners from Allendorf.
Wow.
And the reactions of the sister were very, you know, my mother and I were appalled that she would set foot in Germany again. And yet she went and still is friends with some of the people that she met there, because they wanted to make amends. They wanted to know what happened. They wanted to understand and get beyond that. And I think that there are other people who do that kind of work of learning from the past. There's, God, I've repressed his name. There's a Hungarian Holocaust survivor who works with survivors of Rwanda genocide. Again, bringing them together and learning their commonalities and their shared tragedies is helping them get over that and reconcile.
So this was kind of a facilitating question, meaning opening the conversation to anyone, and so, including our students. I know we've got a lot of students from some different classes that are here today, or that might have seen the advertised event. So really, I would just want to open to anyone. Any thoughts on that question that Jamie asked about how reflecting on trauma, because that's part of it, the history and the trauma, you know, are intertwined. But how does that reflection and that learning and that thinking about the emotions and the relationships and the actions helpful for what's going on right now in our lives?
I think just seeing opening dialogue again is important. It's happening, and it's happening among some Israelis and Palestinians, and said Rwanda. For me, when I was in high school, it was when the race wars were going on in DC. And one of the things that our teachers did is try to bring us together with downtown DC Black students to try to talk, try to learn from each other. I don't know a better way. Do you have other suggestions, Jamie?
Me personally, no. I do think that your talk in general just talks about how people that you don't expect to relate to and to understand can understand in ways that maybe others that are close to you don't. I kind of think about it when I think of your family and how they kind of separated from one another, but kind of found peace in relationships with other people. And like with your Aunt Kitty, who went back and kind of created those relationships with some of those other peoples that she went through those events with.
Yeah, she was the most forgiving of the sisters. broad spectrum there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's bring up kind of as a segue to Rachel's question about the role of forgiveness and, you know, what is encompassed by resilience, right? So Rachel, I don't know if you want to ask those couple questions there to help us kind of move in this direction as we close.
What kind of resilience helps in challenging times like these? And what kind of resistance helps?
Well, for me, I think about the end of your presentation, Dr. Stone, where you talk about kindness. I think that was the most touching part of your presentation for me. And every time you kind of go through it again, that's what strikes me the most, is that these people had no real connection to your family, like, you know, familial wise, blood wise, were the people who stood up for your family and were the people who really helped your family survive the situation. And then I think about how, like, even times today with, you know, with COVID and all the things that are happening, that it's the community that is coming together more. Like, they're the people that stand up for each other. You know, you see people cheering on frontline workers outside of hospitals and other things like that. Just that kindness and that outreach and just that showing of support that really helps people get through those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that's critical to remind people that how much more we can overcome by banding together like that and forming mutual aid acts than by fighting each other over every scrap, which is.
And you know what's important too, I think, is, I'm sorry, to distinguish between, can you hear me? Oh, yeah. There were people who were anti-Semitic, but they were not filled with the kind of hatred that the Nazis were. In fact, I've heard stories where there were people who were quote unquote anti-Semitic, but they tried to hide Jews because they were not at that level. You know what I mean? There was distinction between the badness of anti-Semitism and the ultimate evil of Nazism. Would you agree?
I haven't seen that. Okay. You may be more widely read about, or we read different things. So I haven't seen that.
So, okay.
There's a book called Why the Holocaust Explained, which is a really good primer on this too, that I would recommend to anybody who's interested in learning about it, by Peter Hayes.
Joy?
Yes. Just tying this into Heather Mazur's talk at 12:30, one of the things, and this is some of the work that I do as well, and I should say that my father was a German Gentile immigrant to the US in 1920, in 1923. One of the things that I think is important, and the kindness that Judy is talking about is central. If we are kind to ourselves and take care of ourselves, that is, that's essential actually for helping others. There is something of, there is a harshness that is a part of some cultures. It's certainly, I mean, German culture is extraordinarily harsh toward children. And there's a lot of healing that all of us need, all of us can do in order to heal as a community, as a society, as a world.
Thank you for drawing back to that earlier presentation. I know some of the things that stood out to me were that would draw, you know, connection here also is having flexibility emotionally, you know, mentally or psychologically, physically, and spiritually, right? So kind of just think about the whole person and how we think of those as competencies or skills even now that we're trying to teach students or teach our children or, you know, practice ourselves because we lose touch of those skills. And so even in times of solitude, you know, we've got that opportunity And so I appreciate what you've offered here today to give us that history and that thought about how resistance doesn't always have to be harsh, you know, whether it's to ourselves or to others, that it can be about, you know, resisting what we face in a way that is peaceful and, you know, consistent and helping us to grow and to cope, right, and to heal. I think that's a really important point. So thanks for sharing that, Joy. Thank you, Joy, for joining this to offer some insights. Dr. Joy Kroger-Mappes is one of our Professor Emeritus from Frostburg State, from our Department of Philosophy. So I'm glad you were here for both events today. So many other good people. I know that we want to make sure we respect your time. So I'm just going to close it at this point and ask you to stay in touch. We aren't going to have any more formal events for the community, but Frostburg State's going to probably have some kind of a an opportunity that Dr. Thomas Bulling and I are going to lead about mindfulness practices that you'll probably see some information about coming out.
Yeah,
Watch for that.
great.
Yeah, and the community widespread will be seeing more opportunities like that because there's a powerful program of learning that several of us went through over the past couple months from the Mind-Body Center, Mind-Body Medicine Center out of DC. There's a grant that Sherry Snyder and others from Allegheny College of Maryland have brought to our region to support that education so that we can teach others and share the skills that we learned. So I think that is part of it. It's kind of all, you know, coming full circle.
Good.
So thank you so
you.
much for joining us. Thanks for working through it with us
Thank
with our
you.
technical challenges and just for
Thank you
our
for putting this
conversation.
together.
Thank you for doing this, Alicia.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks to our students, student leaders. Yeah.
Thank you, London.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Yeah, y'all have
Bye.
a good Tuesday. Good night.
And thank you, Patrick.